All right. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. Oh my gosh, it's June 26th. It is hard to believe. So good to see you all. There's my friend Chris Henderson. He's a presenter today. That's awesome. Welcome everybody. We are going to dispense with roll call because this can actually be done just really easily without me having to go through all the names. So I know you're going to miss that. I am going to go ahead and move on to meeting minutes and meeting recaps. I'm going to first start with the full group meeting minutes. All of this should have been in your packets, which you had a link to, which Trace sent out to you a few days ago. So focusing first on the full group meeting minutes of June 5th of 2024. Does anybody have any edits to those meeting minutes? And I see nobody. And if we could then have a motion to approve these meeting minutes and a second, please.
This is Zane, so moved.
Thank you, Zane. Can I have a second?
This is Adriana, I'll second.
Thank you, Adriana, we got you. Great. Is there anybody who's opposed to the approval of these meeting minutes, the general meeting minutes? Okay, I see none. Thank you also for the notes in the chat. First, focusing on the specialized occupations group. You know who you are. You should have a copy of the subcommittee meeting minutes as well as a meeting recap, again, from June 5th of 24. I'm going to just take these as a bulk. Does anybody have any edits to either the meeting minutes or the recap from the Specialized Occupations Subcommittee? You know who you are. I see no hands. Then if we could also have a motion and a second to pass those two documents, I'd appreciate it.
This is Kathy, so moved.
Thanks, Kathy.
This is Adriana, I'll second.
Thank you. Does anybody have any opposition to the approval of the subcommittee, Special Occupations Group, meeting minutes or recaps? And I see no opposition, so those will be approved. Last but not least, our subcommittee, our data subcommittee. We also have meeting minutes and a meeting recap from that document. You know who you are in that subcommittee. Do we have any edits to those two documents? I see no. Okay, fantastic. If we could have a motion to pass or approve both of those documents and a second, please.
This is Michelle Dossie. I'll make the motion.
Thanks, Michelle. Can we have a second, please?
I'll second.
Who seconded? I'm sorry.
Sarah Fieldsticker.
Thank you, Sarah. All right. Is anybody opposed to the approval of the data subcommittee meeting minutes or meeting recap? All right, those documents are approved and my business is done here.
Great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Excited to see y'all. Appreciate you being here. Going to go over a few kind of keeping house items, and then we'll move into our subcommittee groups again. So for those of you that were not here at the last meeting, this is the second meeting of our specialized occupations and data subcommittee meetings today. And we'll throw you into one of those groups if you were not here. So just hang tight with me. But I wanted to make sure we were clear on the dates moving forward. Again, if you don't have any of these calendar invites, please send a note to Addie and myself and we'll get you taken care of. We are in the second of our phase 2 subcommittee meetings, specialized occupation subcommittee with me. You're going to be heading to the other link today. So when we drop it in the chat, and I'm going to remind folks who's in which group here in just a minute. So for those that are in specialized occupations, you're going to go to the other link with me just for recording purposes, and then we'll come back to the main room for public comment before we leave. We're going to be revisiting in our group conversation from last time because we need to tighten up our conversation a little bit and make sure that we can get to a little bit more of a where folks are on things. So thanks to you all that filled out the survey. I think we're in a pretty good spot, but I anticipate about 45 more minutes in conversation there. And then data subcommittee, you are moving on into analyzing the personal information of a child collected for a report. I also wanted to note, well, actually, I'll talk about that in just a minute. For our subcommittees, is there anybody, if you can drop your name in the chat, if you do not see your name listed on here, or who you're proxying for. I know we have a couple of proxies on the call. In the yellow, you're with me. Again, you're going over to the other link, and in blue with data subcommittee, you're with Doris. But today it's Mallory, and I'll introduce Mallory in just a minute. So if you do not see your name here, or you don't know where you're headed, just drop a note in the chat and I'll make sure we assign you. All right, I'm seeing. Yep, so Chris, you're gonna head over to the other link with me. Just FYI, we're gonna drop a link in the chat in just a bit. And Carlos, I'm going to put you in, well, do you have a preference? It's pretty even at this point. You could go to data subcommittee or specialized occupation subcommittee.
Specialized occupation, please.
Cool. Okay, so I'll put your name on this list moving forward and you're going to jump on the link. Everybody else good? Okay, cool. All right, y'all. I'm going to stop there. Real quick, I just want to introduce, I wrangled one of my Keystone colleagues to help me out today. Doris had jury duty. We love an active citizen. And so Mallory Huggins, if you want to wave, Mallory, is actually leads our energy board and is in our Center for Natural Resources over at Keystone, has been here for a long time, but is an expert facilitator. So you'll be in great hands. And so brought her over and she's going to be kind of handling Doris's role today. And Doris will be back at the next meeting. So Mallory, appreciate you being here. I'm going to leave you and your group in this meeting, and then Jordan or whoever's dropping the link in, if y'all want to go ahead and do that. So if you're in that specialized occupation subcommittee, including Chris, just give it a minute because you'll be waiting in the waiting room while somebody goes and gets that meeting started, but then you'll be let in a minute and we will proceed from there. Any questions before we go? Cool. All right, y'all. We'll come back around 9:45 and appreciate everybody coming back to the main room just so we can do public comment, should we have any, and then we'll get you out of here for the day. All right, thanks.
Give it a minute to let the shift happen. Okay. Looks like the movement has stopped here. Except I think, Carlos, did you say you wanted to be in the other one? Do you want to be in the specialized occupation subcommittee? Carlos, can you hear me?
Mallory?
Carlos, you're on mute. Yeah.
Okay, let me close the right one.
Yeah, it's the one. Yeah, the link in the chat is where you should head if you want to be in the specialized occupation.
Okay.
Subcommittee.
Okay,
This is
sorry,
the data
I think
collection
I'm
one.
on board now. Is this is the specialized occupation?
This is
the data collection.
Okay.
Yeah. So if
sorry.
you want, Jordan dropped a link in the chat for a separate room.
All right.
Can you see that
I'll
in
go
the
there.
chat? Yeah. Want to make sure you're where you want to be. Okay, there we go. All right. Excellent. Well, yeah. Hi, everybody. As Trey said, I'm Mallory Huggins, and yeah, as an energy and climate person, this is not my area of expertise or content expertise, but luckily that's y'all's job. Yeah, I'm really just here to sort of keep things on track and, you know, try to make sure we get the questions answered that are helpful for you guys to answer. But I also know you all will have a lot of questions about the directive that we are focusing on today, which is around, as Trace had on the slide, the personal information of a child as set forth in section 19.3.3072 that is collected for a report. And I'll drop that text just in the chat. And I think it overlaps some with directive XIX on a process for inter and intra-agency communication. So there may be a little bit of overlap between those two topics, but we'll try to stay focused on the first one. So just getting that content in the chat there.
And I can drop in, sorry, I just have a link to the 19.3.307 that's referenced so folks can look at the statute if they'd like to, which then has like bullet points for each of the types of information.
Perfect. So we have ideally 3 speakers joining us today. We know we have one person joining us late, Jessica Starr, who's a child welfare research manager, can only join for 30 minutes. So she'll be on in the 8:30 to 9 window. And then we have April Jenkins, who is a child protection and prevention services unit manager. And then, yeah, Brian, I don't know if there's any follow-up we should do to ping JP Sleeger, who's a Trails product manager, since that factors into this conversation, the Trails platform.
Hi. If you can hear me, this is Yolanda Arredondo with the Colorado Department of Human Services. So I have just chatted those colleagues. I let them know I would chat them when to join. So I just chatted them now for the 3 of them. Well, knowing Jessica may take a little bit for the 3 of them to join. So just so you know, thank you.
Okay. And yeah, I just forwarded them the event invite too, so they should have the link and everything they need.
Okay. Great. And I mean, yeah, we have some questions sort of set up, like I said, that we want to get to, but we've also asked the speakers to just introduce themselves at the top and share some, you know, sort of stage setting remarks around topics that relate to this directive. So that's where we'll start. And then we can focus on, you know, questions you all have, and then dip into the questions that we prepared to make sure we kind of cover all of that. Brian, oh, here comes Jessica actually. Before JP joins, is there any other sort of stage setting you feel like that's helpful to do, or does anyone have questions before we dive into the content for today?
I was just thinking just to, because like as it's written, the directive is fairly seemingly cut and dry. Like we could take a second just to look at the personal information that's required from that statute. I know it's a bit dry, but just we could take, you know, 60 seconds to read them together if that's helpful to set the stage for, you know, then questions of like, what do we do with that? Or how do we best collect that? Or do we have the software to handle that?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I can share my screen, or we can just have folks pop over to the link.
I do have a question, Mallory and Brian. So in our last session, we left off with, we need more information, like a list of things that we wanted more detail on. Will we at some point come back and revisit that information once it's been obtained?
Yeah, is this the like Weld County specific questions about the online reporting? Yeah, I know that actually, I don't know if Yolanda has information available on that. There was some work going on in the background. I don't know if that's ready yet to share with the task force, but
Jessica Starr was able to pull the report from Weld County. I have not been able to look at it yet. It just came earlier this week, so it's not ready to be shared. It likely will be at our next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. And yeah, I'll just give everyone a minute or two to refresh themselves per Brian's point on what's currently collected.
I'm just gonna drop the majority of that in the chat just so folks can reference if they like.
Good call. And welcome, Jessica. Thanks for being here. All right. So I know we're waiting on JD, but we could get started maybe with just intros from you, April, and Jessica, and any, sort of stage setting kind of opening thoughts you have around this particular directive. And actually, Jessica, before we go into that, Jessica, I know you had sort of a restricted time window. Can you just let me know when you'll have to hop?
Hey there. So Jessica Montoya-Star, Research Analysis and Data Unit Manager over at the Division of Child Welfare for the state. We are actually going through our United Federal Review right now. So our portion of the federal review, we're actually having the technical overview start from 8:30 to 10. So I think right now I am from 8:30 to 9 here.
Okay, that's what we had, but just wanted to confirm that was right. Okay. All right, yeah, well, April, do you want to kick us off with just intros and then any opening thoughts you have?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm April Jenkins. I'm the Child Protection and Prevention Unit Manager with Colorado Department of Human Services Division of Child Welfare. And so my team oversees the intake portion of child welfare. So we are the folks that are going out into the field and making initial contact with families, taking that initial report that is received through the hotline, taking that information, going out, meeting with the families directly, and assessing concerns for child abuse and neglect. We're also the ones that are updating any information. So to Brian's point that he put in the chat here, any information that is being put in trails, we're the ones looking at that immediately and using that information, obviously, to get to know the family, but also correct anything that may be incorrect or add anything that may be missing. So happy to be here and answer any questions you guys may have with regards to our approach in gathering information on families.
Thanks, April. Jessica, any opening thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I think specifically on the research analysis and data side, my team and I are really the ones that are connected into that, the back end child welfare data system. So we're able to see where really what is being collected from, hotline through referral to if a referral is going to be assessed with that family, understanding those different steps and depending on where the information is being asked, how that ends up impacting throughout the life of that record.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, maybe a good place to start is just kind of on the what and the how, and see if folks have any particular questions on that front in terms of, what's currently collected per the info that Brian dropped in the chat, how that gets collected, if there are gaps in that. And I'd welcome April and Jessica if you have thoughts about those questions, and then we can take comments or questions from the group too.
I'm happy to get started. So Brian had provided me with a list of questions, so I think we're probably going off the same list of questions. So the first one is what child data is currently collected. So obviously Brian did put a lot of that in the chat here. That is a standard template of what is collected when a report is called into the child abuse and neglect hotline. Obviously, a caller can give us as much as they know, or they may not know a lot. But again, it's going to be the responsibility of the intake caseworker or the caseworker that's going out, meeting with the family initially to gather missing any information and placing that in trails. It is important for us to get that accurate. so that we know, our families and that we have accurate information reflected in our system. As you all know as well, House Bill 1046 passed this past year, or just recently was signed, and that is going to ask us to collect a little bit more information than what we may already be collecting. So, and I can reference that a little bit more. That's going to be in addition to what is already in Volume 7. And that is going to include, and we already include some of these, but I'm just going to list it off. Some of these are not included, as you can see from the list. Race, ethnicity, disability status, LGBTQ identity, if applicable, and English proficiency. So English proficiency is one of those that we do not have listed. So that is something that we're going to be asking a little bit more. We're going to be getting ready to draft rule and updating rule on that. So that is more to come. That would align us with House Bill 1046. And so again, I think that does kind of give you a little bit more of kind of a broad overview of what is collected at Hotline. And then again, what is not collected, we're going to collect that when we are meeting with our families. So that's important for us to get that right. I'm going to pause there. Looks like Margaret has a question.
I do. Thank you, April. I'm guessing because the statute references race and you just referenced ethnicity, that this is collected, and I think it would be required by federal law. Are we collecting information on known or rumored, reputed tribal affiliation?
Yes. So we do have a way in Trails to identify if there's any tribal affiliation. Yes. Any other questions?
Ryan and Mallory, I don't have a question, but could you clarify what was behind this directive? Because I don't want to send us off on a tangent with some thoughts if that's not what the focus is. So I understand that we're to look at the personal information of a child that is collected for a report, but is that specifically looking at the statute and considering it for changes, or is there something more specified?
The verb that the bill gives us is to analyze, and then the directive point. I wasn't around yet when this bill was put together, so I don't know if there's any folks who have any insight to the motivation behind it. But generally speaking, the way that the bill that created this task force was put together is that in the consideration of all these things, the task force has the opportunity to suggest recommendations or dig deeper into these details where they find the motivation to do so. So those options are certainly possible in regards to this directive, but there's no our verb that we're applying to this concept is to analyze it. And then if that leads us in a different direction, that's also fair game.
I was around when the bill was, or when the directive, the mandate was given, but I think that the goal, I just don't know if there's someone else that can back that for me, but I think that the goal was to look at the demographic information of a child that is collected. And so that's what I remember. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts about that. I think there was concern about the disproportionality of kids being reported to and being ingested into the child welfare system. And so, we have talked before, I think in this group around, some of the fields that exist in Trails are not mandated fields, and not every reporting party has that information directly. And what we don't want them to do, what the child welfare system doesn't want them to do is to guess. So, I've heard callers on the hotline say they look white, for example, or they look black. And so I just want, I think that's something that we need to tease out about this piece, but there's so much more to this statute that I'm trying to decide, are we supposed to discuss the entirety of the statute or just the demographic information that's collected on a family?
I mean, I think those concerns that you stated about disparate impact in tracking the disproportionate communities that are affected disproportionately is certainly a through line of the bill generally. So if these individual directives touch into that, again, totally fair game. The task force can steer this however it wants.
Well, I'll do the only, I guess, one of the important things that I would want to know, and if we should be tackling this or not, outside of the data collection on a child and their family, is the component at the end of this piece of legislation, which says that mandated reporters are required to also follow it up with a written report, which is an often missed component of the statute. So it said, I have to scroll down for you, but it's like 4 at the very bottom. It says a written report shall be required. So a lot of reporting parties don't know that statutorily they're required not only to make an immediate oral report, but they're required to follow it up in writing. And so that is something that, in Arapahoe, we trained our reporting parties to do, and we advise them of it, but there's no statewide consistent mechanism for collecting written reports and what to do with those written reports. And so it would be my recommendation that we talk about that, and or at some point that it's addressed by the task force as a component, because I think that causes a lot of heartache for a lot of reporting parties. In Arapahoe, we have school reporting forms, and so we have a process by which we have schools, for example, submit their report after their written report after their verbal report. But that does not exist for every mandated reporter in Arapahoe. We used to have like a triplicate form that folks would fill out and mail to us, and we would fill out some additional information, then send it back to to our school districts. But again, that's not a consistent process across the state.
And just not knowing this area as well, like, would it be possible to make that a consistent process throughout the state, or is the design that counties should have the ability to make those decisions for themselves? Like, would it be possible to standardize that?
I think it is possible
to make that recommendation.
I do think it is possible. And I guess I question the necessity of this piece of the law, that what are we achieving by requiring reporting parties to then submit a written report? Is that something that's still necessary? I think it's a waste of time, to be honest with you. It's paperwork pushing. It's more work for reporting parties. It's not documentation it's something that end up being saved on the files of each county, because Trails doesn't have the ability to absorb documents. And so, I don't know if there's anybody else in this subcommittee that can articulate why that was ever put into statute and what a need for that might be. The only thing I think that's been of interest as a county child welfare official is to sometimes see the differences between what's in writing versus what's given on the phone. And so we've done a lot of training in Arapahoe County of our reporting parties about there needs to be consistency between the written document and the oral report.
Hi, this is Yolanda, and I'm sorry I'm traveling, so that's why I'm not on camera and on by phone. So I hope everyone can still hear me okay. So I don't have any insight, Michelle, as to why that was part of the law. I don't know if the timing of it was because, the early stages of a statewide database system and whether that was effective and efficient. I agree with you wholeheartedly that I believe that should be struck from the law, as far as requiring, in addition to like somebody calling in and making an oral report that is then documented in our Trails database system. I don't think that reporting parties should have to follow up with a separate written report. I will say that usually, in my experience, reporting parties don't do that. When they usually do submit things like via email and add additional things, is if they have, say, photos or copies of something that is supplemental, as far as needing, the visual of that supplemental documentation, and that can definitely be helpful and attached to the original referral. Sending in a separate report, though, I think hasn't necessarily been consistent nor helpful in the way maybe it was originally intended. And JP will be joining us shortly, just FYI. The other thing oh, great, JP. Okay, sorry. Again, being on my phone, I can't see everybody's squares easily. So thanks, JP, for joining. The other thing I just wanted to share out too is that I think one of the things that is incredibly problematic when we're talking about collecting demographic information on families and in this directive children in particular is what is the source of that information and at what point in the information gathering and entering into the Trails system does that information go in. So if you see what was copied in the chat about the statute requiring what information to be gathered at the point of essentially hotline when available, and race being one of those, that if the vast majority of reporting parties are educational professionals, medical professionals, law enforcement, they may not have an accurate reflection of how the child, youth, or family would self-identify any of those demographic categories. And then the tricky part is that if there's not an opportunity to confirm that, or we fail to confirm that with the family, then oftentimes the client's record in Trails misrepresents that all of those demographic categories or some of those demographic categories. And that proves problematic down the road when we are trying to ensure data integrity and understand our true disparity and disproportionality rates. If we don't have accurate, often demographic information, especially with race and ethnicity or tribal affiliation, as mentioned before, when we don't have that information accurately, then we really, I think, do a disservice to ourselves in understanding the true representation of disparities and disproportionalities in the state, and definitely a disservice to the families by not having accurate information. So for me personally as well, I know it's hard because legislators and other community members see that that statute and is like, great, we're gathering information, so we better understand our population. And I think there's maybe less full understanding of like, often that information then is inaccurate or unknown, and then it remains that way in the system long term because it's never corrected or we don't have the opportunity to correct it.
And I know
Thanks,
there's changes.
Yolanda.
I know there's changes coming to Trails, the modernization of Trails is happening, but currently as Legacy Trails stands, we also don't have the ability to correctly parcel out multi-racial families, so different race and ethnicities. That is also a challenge. And I think most people don't understand that part of the system either, that when we are looking at data, it's not a mandated field, meaning there's not a requirement to enter it. And then when it is entered, you can't fully identify the family properly in Trails.
If you don't, Michelle, the question of the written component of the report, I just am looking back at the bill that created the task force, and it says the task force at a minimum shall consider, and then gives us these directives. So even though that's not a named directive, it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. But just for the purposes of this meeting, where we have these three panelists have come to talk about the information collected, if you wouldn't mind, we kind of put a pin in that conversation for a little bit, and we can return to it if there's the desire for it. But just for today. And then obviously the two overlap because the information that's collected in one way or another influences the type of report that's able to be sent in and then what's done with that report. But I just wanted to make sure we're making the most of the time we have with these experts in the field.
Yeah, and I also want to just give JD a chance to say hi, because obviously we're getting deep in the conversation, and I'll just note, I'm hearing a couple things emerging already. One is just concerns about the accuracy of some of the information that gets collected because some of it may not be known, but may be guessed or unknown, and then that stays in the system, especially with respect to things like race and ethnicity. And then this issue, which perhaps is a tweak in the system, I don't know, but ability to connect or collect data and for multiracial families. And I don't know if there's a tweak that could be made that makes that a little easier to address, or at least possible to address. And then, like Brian said, we can put a pin in the written report piece, and just note that that's a concern as well, but try to stay focused on the info collected. I don't want to lose the comment from you, Yolanda, from the chat just about how this conversation intersects with SB 24-200. So just want to note that you said that. Jessica, before we go to you, JP, do you want to just say a quick hi and talk about your role, and then Jessica, we'll take your comment.
Yeah, thanks, Melly. Can everyone hear me? I'm on my phone. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is JP Sleeger. I'm the product manager for Trails, which is Colorado's child welfare information system. my role is to kind of balance the maintenance of the legacy system while getting all of our users into the modernized system as soon as ethically possible. So I'm happy to participate and answer any questions you have. I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a caseworker, but I have a pretty good familiarity with the system and how it operates. So happy to answer any questions or support anything as needed for this conversation. So nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, JP. And Jessica, I want to take your comment.
Yeah, I guess I was just curious about what was the specific tweak for multiracial families?
Well, I was hearing that maybe it's not possible to, or that the system isn't set up to receive data for multiracial
Yes,
families.
it is. Is that
what I heard?
So,
Oh, okay.
So essentially, the way that we want to think of this as Trails has specific race and ethnicity fields that can be selected. And those requirements are guided by our federal requirements for child welfare systems that are coming from the federal government, including reports that really directly ties to some of our federal funding. And so there are fields specifically for Hispanic ethnicity, which I think is yes, no, unknown, or declined to answer. And then there's multi-select for race. So you can select one to many for, I want to say, white, Black or African American, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian, and Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So for me in Trails, with my family history, I would be selecting yes for white, yes for American Indian, Alaskan Native, and also selecting yes for Hispanic. And that would be able to be reported out.
Okay, thanks. And I forgot who brought up the multiracial family piece, but I wonder if that, if that addresses the concern that was raised there, Michelle.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask, I don't know if Yolanda can speak to that. It's obviously been just a little bit of time since I've been in Trails, but I have had complaints from caseworkers that you cannot multi-select family, like it is not full and balanced about the data that can be entered into there, but I would need to get into Trails to look at it, to see it, Jessica. I don't know, again, if Yolanda can add to that at all, or April.
Well, this is Yolanda again. I don't know if I guess I'd need to know more about the question or issue being raised. It might be that the categories are limiting, that people may feel like, because I believe Jessica and JP can correct me if I'm wrong. I think they're based on like census, like the way that census race and ethnicity is captured. And I think that there is a limitation in that by itself. Not that you couldn't select two or more race categories. It's just that the categories themselves are very limiting compared to, how people might choose to self-identify.
Thanks, Yolanda. And I see Margaret and JP.
JP, I'm going to defer because I have a feeling that your comment is more directly related to this present conversation.
Thanks, Margaret. Happy to circle back if it doesn't, but I want to clarify. In Trails, the general business process flow.
Sorry, you can't hear you. I can at least.
Oh,
I can. Was he just quiet, or you couldn't hear him at all, Brian?
can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
I can.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just to clarify the general business process flow as caseworkers are interacting with Trails, we have the modernized system. We still have the legacy system. Generally speaking, the intake portion of the child welfare business flow, process flow, begins in Trails Mod. So as caseworkers are interacting with families and getting to know them and searching for them, most of that work is done in Trails Mod. And before new people can be added into Trails, the Trails system forces the caseworker to conduct a client search based on the information entered, name, date of birth, race if known, and so the system forces the caseworkers to check for existing people based on the entered criteria before the system lets caseworkers enter new clients. And obviously there's flexibility within there, but also to the point of race and ethnicity, if people are added to records, generally that's done in Trails Mod, not exclusively, but for hotline, for referral, and for assessment, which is modernized as of Sunday this week. All of that engagement with families is done in Trails Mod. And so the only time that caseworkers would be entering new information on families would be as if there's kind of an ongoing involvement with them in case in the legacy system. So Michelle is right that legacy does not currently permit caseworkers to multi-select race, but that is done a fraction of the time compared to Trails Mod, which does allow for the multi-selection of race. So I don't know kind of specifically what the split is between adding new clients, but I think I would guess it's at least 75-25 Mod to legacy. So it is an issue that cannot be done, but thankfully it doesn't happen very often, if that kind of helps clarify the frequency and the system that we've built to mitigate some of those issues that caseworkers were experiencing with legacy.
So for non-child welfare staff on the call, I think just a point of clarification, just so you kind of have context for what we're talking about. There was an older version of Trails, which is what we're referencing as Trails Legacy, versus Trails Mod, which is the modernization of Trails that has been phasing in to child welfare over a period of years. And I was referencing Trails Legacy and the inability to do the multi-race pieces and stuff like that. So the modernization, and I did just hear that the assessment phase is just rolled out. So that's good. Previous to that, what I was saying was applicable. So now that, the assessment phase has been rolled out, that will alleviate some of those issues.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying this too, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. And I just want to make sure I understand, I think what you said, JP, that it sounds like the new system allows for the multi-selection. And so that's all good. So whether you're entering a new person into the system or adding to an existing person in the system who is added into the modern version of the system, you'd have that option. The only issue would be if you were adding to somebody who was first entered in the legacy system, where previously you didn't have the ability to multi-select. But that is a less common issue.
So Trails Mod and Trails Legacy is the same database. It's just two different applications that caseworkers use to access the same information. And so we have a lot more ability to customize what caseworkers see in the mod system as opposed to the legacy system. So even though you can't necessarily see that a client identifies as multi-race or identifies as transgender or something like that in the legacy system, it is still referencing the same client information. So it's more of an ability of what caseworkers are able to see and interact with in the legacy system versus what they have the flexibility and capability of doing in the mod system. And so you can edit client information within the mod system if it was originally entered in case. It's just if caseworkers are in legacy, if they find someone new within the family and they're entering them new within the case, they generally do that in legacy, and that does not allow them to do kind of the multi-race selection, although they can go into mod and do it there. It's just preferences and preferred flows and everything like that. Yes.
Okay, got it. Brian, do you want to hop in before Margaret?
Yeah, I guess just a context setting question. Can somebody remind me and folks writing the recap and just the sense of timeline about like phasing over entirely to mod and then phasing out of Trails, or how long the two systems will be, or the two applications will be side by side, just to see how this all plugs in together?
Brian, that's everyone's favorite question to ask. And we've unfortunately learned a lot of unfortunate lessons along the way of modernization. So I purposefully don't commit to anything until we have a better sense of the actual level of effort that would be involved in getting there. We just had a huge release of modernizing the rest of kind of the intake portion, which we refer to as assessment, on Sunday. So I think that finalizes the modernization of the intake process. Case is the only thing that's left. I think we're ballparking, hopefully maybe the end of the next calendar year as full modernization, but that's a very broad ballpark estimation.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Margaret, let's bring you in.
So I'm thinking about the focus of our directive. And I kind of want to pull the lens out a little bit because we're talking about a lot of focused data collection. And I didn't realize until Yolanda pointed this out this morning that SB 24200 is now requiring what I've just put into the chat, specifics about disability status, language, things that don't appear in the mandatory reporting statute. And I think it makes sense to create something consistent so that the Department of Human Services isn't trying to serve a million different directives. And honestly, I keep thinking about if our focus is to prevent disproportionality, we have Title VII, as April talked about earlier, collecting all this information, but the statute isn't calling it out more broadly. Maybe what we need to do is marry these statutes so that this information is front of mind. It makes me crazy to make law that is bulky and broad instead of having regulations that refine the law. But if we are in fact collecting all of this data already, but that's not adequate, and that's why we sit here in this space today, maybe we need to call it out specifically. But boy, does it give me heartburn to use income as something that we need mandatory reporters to be thinking about. So I just kind of wanted to put this hornet's nest in your lap.
I echo what Margaret said.
Just pausing for additional reactions or comments. I want to note just that we only have Jessica for a few more minutes, hopping at 9. So just in terms of some of the back end data questions, if anyone has anything burning on that front in terms of comments or questions, we should take advantage of the few minutes we have left with Jessica.
I don't know that I have a question of Jessica, but I don't know if maybe she can speak to this either, but I still have concern about this struggle between a reporting party who doesn't know the information that we're asking the information of them to provide. They don't know it, and it's not a mandated field to be collected. And I know when we would pull data in Arapahoe County, like roughly 45% of the race and ethnicity data was missing. It doesn't dispute and or minimize the disproportionality because I know it exists. This is, I think, a challenge for the child welfare system is that, we have incomplete data, so we don't know the true extent of the disproportionality and where exactly it lies. And again, I struggle with asking for it at the hotline to get it from a reporting party who may not know it or have it accurately. But the same goes for even when it's collected by an assessment or intake caseworker, that what steps are they taking to ensure that the information is accurate before it gets entered into trails and becomes permanent record?
And Michelle, I think you raise good points with that, because the way that I view trails, just from my lens of like the research side, is how is trails being applied? We kind of see trails in Colorado as kind of like our source of truth when it comes to child welfare information, because that's our centralized database that all of our 64 counties enter information. We know that that information can be used for court cases. We know that that information can be used for major decisions with children, youth, and families, and family structure and permanency. And so as the data steward, it's kind of like my team's big mission is to make sure that we are having as accurate information as possible. And I think that really touches on making sure that we're looking at who is our closest source of truth when it comes to this information, because we want to make sure that we are representing children, youth, and families as accurately as possible that we can in our database. We had ran a pilot 2 to 3 years ago with 3 counties to look at families that were having an assessment or that face-to-face work. And we had found, again, it was about 50% of those families that had data that already existed in Trails had their race and ethnicity information updated from what it was to how the family actually identified. The majority of that were families that were coming in with unknown race, unknown ethnicity. However, we also had, for example, families that were American Indian, Alaska Native that were not previously identified. But when talking to the family, were identified, which depending on, if there had been a removal, that starts going into massive ICWA territory of, were the proper people notified or even included in that? I think it's really important to really make sure that we're looking at it with the lens of trying to reduce as many assumptions as possible and really reinforcing that if there's information being entered, that on the caseworker, on the supervisor side, making sure that we're verifying that information with the family if that information is being screened in, and we're going to be working face-to-face with that family because they are ultimately the source of truth. And we really want to make sure that if we want to be able to tackle disproportionality, we have to make sure our baseline data is as accurate as possible. We can't be making assumptions, well, this is what the reporter said, which understandably, especially mandatory reporter, they're probably going to have more face-to-face interaction with that child, youth, or family. However, the child, youth, or family is that key source of information.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And I guess this is just continuing to elevate that, like, one of the main concerns with all of this is inaccuracy of data or absence of data and desire to get as complete information as possible so that we're all working with a good baseline. GP?
Yeah, just to clarify real quick, obviously I haven't been involved in your conversations previously, so if I'm way out in left field, feel free to ignore me. But I think a couple of things I was picking up on that I want to quickly clarify is that, and I can show you an example of a record in Trails if you want to see it, but we do not collect race, ethnicity information at the hotline call. If a mandatory reporter makes a report, they collect family name, they collect family address, they collect contact information, they collect, the address of the incident if it was different than the household address. But the mandatory reporter is not expected to report the race and ethnicity when making a call. That information is gathered by the county caseworkers when they go out and interview the family for a referral. So if that helps clarify or set boundaries, mandatory reporters are not expected to report the race ethnicity when making a call to the hotline.
If it's okay, JP, I just want to provide a little bit more context and clarification. So call takers do information gather around race and ethnicity. It's added into the narrative. So what JP is specifying is that when we're creating that initial referral, there is not a category that is mandated for the call taker to fill out as far as race and ethnicity goes. However, that information usually is attempted to be gathered and entered into the narrative. And then that's where sort of the process piece takes over about whether or not once a referral is created, our clients added to that at that point based on what the reporting party gave as names, dates of birth, race, ethnicity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, all of that? Or is that done if there's an intervention and an assessment done on the family, and then the caseworker gathers it at that time? So thank you for saying that, JP. Yes, there are not race and ethnicity categories at the point of hotline that are like checkboxed. Yet we do try to gather that information and put it in.
And 193307 says that reporting parties shall provide, it says including race. So it's name, address, age, sex, and race of the child. So reporting parties are required to provide it whenever possible is what the statute says.
I don't know how others feel. I think it would be helpful, JP, if you were able, I know you created like as an example record that doesn't share any confidential information. If folks are interested, I think it'd be great for JP to share that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I went in yesterday, day before, and created a fake record. So if you recognize some names, it is a pop culture reference, but I wanted to create some fake data if people wanted to see what we collect in the system. So let me figure out how to share my screen. And I'm happy to show the information that is collected in a hotline record.
And Ida, I just saw you come off mute for a second. Did you have a question?
No, I was just affirming that it would be helpful to take a look at trails.
Endorsing the,
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I think just as JP is getting this set up, and JP, let us know if you're having any sharing issues. I'm not in charge of the settings, but we can figure out a way to share if you're struggling. But just want to put in your brains that I want to start to move this discussion towards recommendations or areas for improvement, and recognizing some of the issues we've talked about so far. Are there things you all would want to see change in terms of how this data is collected and shared?
Yeah, Mallory, I finally found the button that was highlighted in green and not white like the others. But there is a note that says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Let me see. Okay, I do have the ability to change that. Try one more time. I wasn't sure if I could change it, but it looks like I could.
There we go. Okay. Okay. Is everyone able to see this okay? I can minimize this. Okay. Is everyone able to see the hotline detail screen?
Yep.
Okay. So this is just kind of the generic call summary information. You know, the system generates a numeric unique ID for each record. We got the dates and the time of the call, the responsible county, call taker county, primary worker, call type, PA4, PA5, call reasons, substance. If substance utilization is part of a call reason, then the substance abuse panel becomes active. And then this is the reporter information that's collected, you know, first name, last name, email, phone number, method, type, relationship, et cetera, et cetera. This is the family information that's collected in the hotline record. One of the new additions that we have with the assessment mod rollout is that we are now allowing caseworkers to interact with Google and click this show on map link so they can see the address that was entered within Google Maps for a better sense of where it is and how to get there. But you can see that there's no kind of client level information, at least to Yolanda's point, in the fields here within the record. A lot of that stuff is captured here to her point. But these are just kind of like manually entered information as part of kind of the overall description of the narrative that was happening. It's not kind of distinctly called out in some of our broader fields. Anything anyone wants to see or dig into a little bit while I have this up?
Okay, thanks for sharing that.
Mallory, I think one of the recommendations, I'm just basing that off of Margaret's suggestion, but that I do think we have to align House Bill 1046 and Senate Bill 24200 to match what's currently, I mean, there's, you know, these are now going to be different places that it's listed and that we're gonna need to make sure are aligned. And then, the state from there the Division of Child Welfare from there can align volume 7, which are our rules and regulations that govern the work that we do with what the statute says, to include how we are asking for that information, both obviously at the hotline, but also if then an assessment is open, then how that, the caseworker is gathering that information.
I'm
Michelle, I
curious.
just
And
put
Mallory,
it,
just real quick.
Yep. I think I saw April, JP, and Brian. April, let's start with you.
sorry, yeah, so Michelle, I just put it in the chat. I completely agree, and we'll have to align that language when we get ready to put that in volume 7.
JP?
Yeah, thanks. Two quick things. So I also have to hop soon to go to the same meeting that Jessica went to at the NIDED review next door. Happy to answer questions, but final point, as you discuss this more, just know that since we are building out a new system, obviously the ability to add edits change. The information that's collected is a lot easier to do now with a modernized system, and that is more or less my primary job, is to prioritize what we build, what we fix, what we change. And so if there is a desire to explore changing information collected at any point, hotline referral assessment, know that we have the capability to do that now relatively easily and relatively quickly. So if that helps inform the conversations you have going forward, if there are changes that people want to see, know that those changes can be made relatively easily, relatively straightforward.
Great. Thank you. Brian, had you come off mute too?
Yeah, I was just going to ask on the point that both Michelle and Margaret have made on joining those two statutes or having them interact. Is there any, are there any folks in the task force who disagree with that or who find that a controversial statement? I'm just wondering, we've heard two people affirm that sentiment. I'm wondering if there's any diversity of opinions on that area.
Can I talk about my internal conflict related to my statement in support of that idea? I just keep going back to, what is the job of the reporter? What's the job of DHS? And I know we want to get to this disproportionality piece, but I don't think that the tool to get there is asking reporters to know race, ethnicity, disability, income, language, all those things. That's just not their job. And I'm very conflicted about it, but I think that we would be foolish to move forward without acknowledging that this other obligation exists.
And for clarification, I'm not as familiar with 24200, if I'm even remembering the number correctly. But so that's a requirement on the. Who is that a requirement for? Is that to create a report that contains that disaggregated information rather than creating a requirement for the data collection? But we're trying to order those things correctly.
It's specifically for DHS, and it references this data with respect to the children that are in the child welfare system and their family. So they're really important data points and really critical in understanding how the system is serving these populations, but I mean all of our populations, but it's that piece of what do we want to see in the reporting statute that is giving me heartburn, which is why we're here.
Yeah, the intent behind that bill, specifically the Senate Bill 24200, is really around holding the child welfare system accountable at the county and the state level to identify and report out on diversity, equity, and inclusion data, and holding us accountable to make sure that we identify and address the disproportionality. But I understand the conflict absolutely that Margaret's in, and I think for me, it's less about the specific data being collected. I mean, I think it's an important piece of that, but it also comes down to how did the decision to report today, how was it impacted by the family's race and ethnicity and disability and ability to speak English, and really challenging reporting parties to know that about their families and examine how they came to make that report. Because although the child welfare system is fraught with its own disproportionality in its decision making, it starts at the front door when the phone call rings. And what we know, and in looking at data, I can at least tell you in looking at Arapahoe County data, is that we would see disproportionality, based on a certain type of reporting party, that we would see higher levels of Black and brown children being reported by school districts when there were equal rates of abuse or neglect. They would choose to report on a Black and brown family versus a white family. And so that the thought and the interest to me lies and starts with who is reporting it. So in order to properly ensure that we address disproportionality, we have to rely upon our reporting parties to know the information and to think about that before they make a report or consider how that's impacting their report that day.
I wholeheartedly agree, Michelle. I think that gets to the spirit of House Bill 200 and moves it forward. In addition to that, I'm wondering if we could talk about adding to this list of information to include family strengths. I think this is a pretty deficit-based reporting system, and so taking a look at where the strengths of the family are as known by the reporting source also has that same impact to get reporters thinking about what supports the family might need and what they're bringing to the table as experts on their family.
Could you say more about what those strengths might be, like what they might be reporting on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you talked about, let's say we talked about it from a school perspective, the children, there's a concern related to physical abuse, but the children are always at school on time. There's never been an issue with attendance policy violations. There's involvement of the parent potentially in the school as a volunteer. There are lots of ways that a reporting source might have some idea about where the family strengths lie, in addition to this maltreatment report, which is one small window into family life. And so I know a number of counties already ask for this information through the enhanced screening process, but I think kind of taking a look at where other possibilities lie to make this more of a statewide practice would be really important.
Any other reactions or agreement or disagreement with that idea from Ida?
I'm curious if anyone's aware of any other types of like state data collection that does hit on those questions, or if there are any models to replicate or consider when thinking about how to adapt that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, just for I'm wondering if there are any like examples of the system or the types of questions that Ida was hoping for. Any examples that already exist within the state, just that could be like utilized as a model for this kind of data collection?
And yeah, I can answer that a
collecting
little
info
bit.
on family strength.
Yeah, and I can answer that a little bit too. So, as most of you know, we are a differential response model state. So we do have multiple tracks, two different tracks of assessments that came about as part of the differential response. But one thing that did come out about in the differential response is an enhanced screening. So as part of that enhanced screening, and you may not have seen that in that example that JP shared, some of those questions includes family strengths. So some of those are supporting strengths. What are some gray areas, or what is not really known? So there's a lot more questions that you probably didn't see from that, but strengths is one of those that is asked as part of the enhanced screening at Hotline. So Yolanda, I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, but I do think that's being captured. Now, whether it's always answered may not be, right?
I think there are other states, Brian, to your point, that collect, through an enhanced screening tool, collect family strengths. What I don't think is available, and I could be wrong, but I don't think is available is the ability to collect data on that. There is no, I don't know if there is a way to shift 19.3.307 to say that the reporting party must also provide, family support, family strength information. I don't know how you legislate that. I'd have to think through that a little bit more. But I think that the child welfare system traditionally has been set up to find the deficit in a family and report that. Identify, if you look at 19.3.307, it specifically says that we want to know the extent of injury, the types of abuse and neglect. The way that this portion of the statute is set up is to only look for the problem in the family and report the problem. And I think that's where therein lies the problem that Ida's trying to share, is that we come from a negative perspective, and it's only the incident that then drives the concern versus looking at a family holistically and really encouraging reporting parties to give a balanced perspective. And so I think certainly that should be a part of any mandatory reporter training that is offered, and which is what I often train to, is families should be more than just the incident that defines them. There is much more to family than, a parent who slaps a child and leaves a black eye, which is statutorily required for us to investigate. Families are defined by more than just that. And shouldn't have just an incident focused lens. And so it is hard, and we do it to draw that information out, but I think it should be incumbent upon the reporting party to automatically have to provide a balanced perspective of a family.
Thanks, Michelle. I saw some nods and emojis of support for your comment there. I want to acknowledge just that there were a couple of questions that came up in the prep. I just want to see if it's worth spending any time on them, because I know we could still talk about some of the, if there are recommendations to address some of these concerns about, sort of getting the data that's needed, but whether, getting the data that is needed from a mandatory reporter is really, doing, or is really the appropriate way for that to come in, sort of echoing just the tension that Margaret shared about those issues. So we can come back to some of those concerns, but do we want to talk at all about what gets collected and then what gets reported to law enforcement, and or what kind of information is available to the public? I think we've touched on what's changing about trails, so I think we've spent a good amount of time on that. But yeah, is there any interest? I don't know if that's maybe a question for you, Brian, or just among the group in learning more about or talking more about how this information gets transmitted elsewhere, whether to law enforcement or the public.
Yeah, I'll open that up to the group. That was just a potential angle that we had thought the conversation might go towards, is knowing that reports can come in a variety of ways, including through law enforcement as well as through county departments of human services. Any discussion of the nuance or differences on the type of information that comes in for law enforcement versus some other, or just considering the different permutations that reports happen.
I think one of the challenges that we have in the child welfare system is the way that the statute is written, is that we're required to report every incident of abuse or neglect to law enforcement and the DA. law enforcement is also obligated to turn around and report to us if they if they get the information first, right? So the statute says a mandatory reporter shall report to law enforcement or human services. It does not specify it by the type of abuse or neglect. So you've heard some of us talk before about the difference between interfamilial abuse and neglect versus third-party abuse and neglect. So interfamilial means the perpetrator and the child are related versus third-party where they're not related. Law enforcement is the only entity that generally investigates third-party incidents, whereas they investigate both interfamilial, as does the Department of Human Services. So the statutes are muddied around the cross-reporting and the obligation to cross-report. And it states that any copy of a report of known or suspected abuse shall be transmitted to the DA and law enforcement immediately. And that is great for some counties and not great for other counties. So for example, in Arapahoe, we have 11 jurisdictions, law enforcement jurisdictions versus the city and county of Denver that has 1. So our jurisdictions cannot handle 30,000 calls a year of us just sending every report over. And so that statute has been a challenge in Arapahoe County. I know it's a challenge in other large counties that have multiple jurisdictions. They don't have the mechanism in place to manage getting a copy of every report that we receive, to review it and then determine what their action is going to be.
Thank you. Yeah, and for what it's worth, I know we addressed this earlier on, but this is starting to overlap a little bit with our next conversation, which is the directive for, pardon me, analyzing a process for inter and interagency communications, confirming receipt of reports, and in some circumstances sharing the outcome of reports with certain mandatory reporters. So we'll definitely get to the meat of that. I wonder if is there any substantial difference between the type of information that comes in through a law enforcement report? I guess that's just the general question.
I can answer some of that. So there is going to be some differences, and now whether substantial differences, I don't think so. And I would start to say no. I mean, they are not going to have a lot of the demographics that we know. I've met with law enforcement agencies a lot over the years who says, I don't know what race or ethnicity they are. I don't know if they have Native American heritage, and I'm not asking. It is not really pertinent to my role as a law enforcement officer. So they're not gathering some information. There could be some guessing, and there could be some accurate information as well. But there is going to be some disparities in the type of information we get. Most of the information we get is very narrative based, and it's narrative meaning directly from their police report that they have written, and not a lot of demographic information. It's going to give us names, addresses, and the narrative of events. That is about it. Outside of that, we're pulling, when we put that information into our system, we're going to be pulling in anything that was there previous, or that may be pulling in from other systems that we can help identify the family. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, that helps me. Does that line of thought provoke any questions or comments from other task force members who'd like to dig into deeper?
You know, I'll be curious to see with these new statutes, both 1046 and 200, to see if how that plays in when we receive reports from law enforcement when they don't have that information, and what the county's obligation is then to further identify it and document it. Because April's right, law enforcement is not gathering English proficiency, they're not gathering disability, they're not gathering LGBTQ status, none of
that. For me, this is Yolanda again, sorry. I just keep coming back to like the dilemma or the issue about at which point we're gathering and entering or inputting the information, because one of the issues is, say, like JP showed us an example of a hotline record. So if information is gathered and entered at the point of a hotline record, and then, we have enough information, we believe, to enter a new client record. Yet if that referral is not assigned to a caseworker for further assessment, there's not the opportunity to connect with the family and verify whether or not all of the demographic questions we may ask of the reporter, whether they're law enforcement or someone else, to ask if those are accurate based on how the family identifies. So we may not have the chance to correct the record in that sense if a referral is taken, not accepted for assessment, and remains as a historical record in our Trails database. One of the issues, though, and the dilemmas of when do we enter a new client record, for example, if it's a brand new client that's not known to Trails, if we don't do that at referral and it's not accepted for assessment, then we will not be able to know that a previous referral was called in on that family, because we won't have a client record to search to say, have any other previous referrals ever been called in on this family? So, and yet, if we enter a new client record at the point of referral without accurate demographic information, because it's coming from a mandatory reporter likely, or a community member or a family member as the reporting party, so we miss out on the ability to have historical accuracy of how many times a client has potentially been referred to child protection if we don't have a client record, or a client record, like we don't enter their name as a new client. Yet we also might capture inaccurate demographic information that remains historically on them if there's never an intervention in which we can then confirm directly with the client if that information we gathered is correct. And I just keep going back, like it just circles in my mind over and over, because you don't want to not know that a family has previously been referred, because you want to know if that's happened, especially to the point of disparity and disproportionality. Like we wouldn't know if that family was reported maybe maliciously or for any other reason over and over again. But if we don't have a client record entered into Trails, yet the demographic information could remain truly inaccurate. And I think kind of also too, what I struggle with is the practice part. It's not legislated, and it's not specifically in our administrative rules about having caseworkers verify and correct information, demographic information on a family when and if they do intervene and assess with a family. And so that looks different county from county. And Jessica Starr briefly mentioned a pilot we did a few years ago, and that was just a handful of counties, and we saw so many corrections that would have needed to be made to client records based on, in that pilot was just race and ethnicity, not all the other important demographic categories as well that we would need to verify information. And I can't say across the 64 counties of Colorado how consistent each county or even each person or each unit is in how they go about confirming accurate demographic information with a family, especially when there's already a client record in Trails. That's one of the opportunities I think we miss over and over again, is that if I, Yolanda Arredondo, already have a client record in Trails and there's already demographic fields filled out about me, how likely is it that the caseworker is going to ask me again, is this how you identify? Is this accurate for you now? Should I change this if this is how your client record has captured this particular demographic category? So I don't believe that that's happening very consistently across the state, especially when a record is already in Trails. And that worries me. That worries me tremendously.
Can we make that a recommendation, Brian and Mallory? That
right.
volume
So,
7 gets, that there's volume 7 rule change.
And I just want to make sure because it sounds like the issue is that there's not really a mechanism there's certainly no mechanism for correcting the data that was captured if there's no referral. So then that historical data is just inaccurate and stays inaccurate. But there's also inconsistency about whether data gets corrected if someone is staying in the system and being engaged with. Some jurisdictions might follow up on that and correct it, but it doesn't sound like that's happening in a widespread fashion. So yeah, maybe to Michelle's point, like, is there a recommendation around that in terms of verification of what gets collected?
For me, I think that would come out as like a recommendation for the Colorado Department of Human Services to promulgate rule regarding the process by which demographic information is like confirmed or verified with the family if and when like an assessment or an intervention occurs.
Yes, collected, corrected, and confirmed.
Collected, corrected, and confirmed. Yeah.
And I also, I mean, again, please correct me, Yolanda or April, if I'm wrong, and it's come out in Trails Mod, but at least in Trails Legacy, it's not a required field until the child is in placement or removed from the home. And so so I could go in and do an investigation and never update, correct, or fill out that information and close the assessment and not gather that information. I wasn't required to gather that information. That was the other challenge that we had in Arapahoe, is that when we pulled data down, let's just say it wasn't entered at the hotline. The intake or assessment caseworker was not gathering that information with the family and entering it in, because we would find often, again, roughly about 50% of the time, there was no demographic data, even after we had been inside a family's home. It wasn't until it was in a case that we were required to enter that. So I also would suggest or recommend that we promulgate rules to require that it be anytime that we meet with the family, that information be entered. Otherwise, it's a mandatory field in Trails. You can't close it until it's filled out.
And I think Michelle, that we're just initiating our full analysis of the Senate Bill 24-200, because as JP mentioned, with assessment now in a Trails modernization, if we do have to change those categories to mandatory at the point of assessment instead of only at case, then I think it's much easier for us to do that now with Trails modernization as a dynamic application. And when we're further assessing Senate Bill 24-200, that's now law, I think we will probably make some decisions about mandating many of those demographic categories, because otherwise the analysis and the provision of that information in any report is going to be very spotty at best, because some people will have filled it out and some people will not have filled it out, and those who have filled it out, it may be inaccurate. So trying to just narrow down to more accurate and more consistent data gathering information practices. So yeah, I imagine there will be some fields that go to mandatory. One other thing, I don't know that it's necessarily within the scope of this group. I just wanted to put it out there as far as with recommendations. I think one of the tricky things, this is more about if there was a recommendation coming out of this task force and this sub work group in particular about like we were saying, the collecting and correcting and confirming of information. I think one of the practice areas, and April may be able to speak more to this with intake, is if there is a difference in how a youth, let's say a child or a youth, would identify themselves as with how their parent would identify them. And especially I think where we've seen this is around like gender expression, sexual orientation, even sometimes race and ethnicity, and trying to also make sure that we're not being over prescriptive, yet we're also acknowledging the importance of self-identity, and that if, like in my opinion, like if a child or youth identified themselves particularly in a given way, that I would want to respect and represent that in their client record. And every time if there is a new assessment or a case or things like that, I'm also checking in on that, because especially with certain demographics or how identity may shift over time for how people self-identify, that it's not that if you said, oh, well, I'm this gender expression or this sexual orientation or this race or ethnicity today, that doesn't mean that there's not room to change and update the record as well over time.
Yeah. April, I don't know if you have a response to that question in particular, and I saw you had your hand up in general.
Yeah, I want to go back just a tiny bit to something Michelle said too, and in the conversation about it being required in Trails and in an assessment to identify race ethnicity. So in an assessment, it was blocking, you cannot close an assessment if the fields are not completed. So it would come up with an error at the end saying, if it's not completed, obviously you can't close it. Now that still does not eliminate inaccuracies, right? Because there still could be inaccuracies. So some of those same guidelines are translating over to Trails Mod and the modernization of Trails Mod that we are in now. So all assessments are now in Trails Mod. And just looking in here, I mean, we can select multiple race ethnicities. We also there's a section where you can say that the client declined to disclose. So that it is getting better, but I will say that it does not allow you to just close it with nothing. You have to have something, but to Michelle's point, it still could be inaccurate. We would hope it's not.
Well,
so.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
just
want
want
to
to
return
add.
to the.
Oh, sorry.
There you
Just
go.
let me add this one thing, because I think for those that haven't done like casework practice, it's important to know the reality, right? So we're being honest and we're being transparent about the struggles that we face in our child welfare system for data accuracy. To your point, though, April, I think what I know I have been guilty of, many years ago as a caseworker and have seen other caseworkers do is that even when it comes to those mandated fields, if I never asked the family, I don't see the practice a lot of times of caseworkers saying, oh, let me go follow back up with the family to ensure that I have an accurate self-identification reflected in trails. It was like, well, here's their surname. I saw them in person. I believe them to be this race and ethnicity. Maybe I did ask them about cultural considerations. If I didn't ask them about race and ethnicity, though, I may be either entering what the mandatory reporter said, or I may be just using my own bias, right, to assume how they would identify. And I think that that's one of the issues too, is that it's the mandatory fields and trails that can be helpful as far as points of requiring data entry. It's only though as accurate as the caseworker who's engaging with the family and actually asking the question of the family, how would you self-identify? And then accurately reflecting that in trails. And if that piece of the practice isn't happening, it doesn't matter if we have a mandatory field, because it could still just be filled out by someone who's guessing. Like, and I know that happens, because I know that I did that as an assessment worker. It's like, oh crap, I forgot to ask them. Well, they look this way, or they have this, surname, or they have this, like, so I'm just going to enter yes on Hispanic or whatever categories. And that was absolutely a disservice to the families.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know a few folks nodded along to the idea of maybe incorporating a recommendation around confirming or verifying information, whether or not someone stays in the system. And I'm just curious if there's any dissent to going that direction, or maybe pursuing a recommendation along those lines. Any concerns with that? Okay. So a few head shakes and silence. So we'll take that as a no immediate dissent, at least. I mean, it seems like to me, at least, as obviously, again, a non-expert here, but what this is boiling down to is that there's less concern necessarily about what is getting collected, because there's a desire to have most of this information, and helpful to have the additions of some new requests or new things maybe with these new bills that have passed, but making sure that it's clear how that we want to make sure these bills are synced up when the final rule gets drafted. But so it seems like it's less about the information that we desire to know and more about kind of where that comes in and at what point it gets verified, because it sounds like there's plenty of concern around being able to guarantee that information can be accurate if it's coming in at the reporter level, because it just might not be known or people might be guessing. So I don't know, which again, I guess points to the value of maybe this being more about confirming and verifying after that initial intake. So yeah, again, in summary, I think it doesn't seem like there's a lot of concern with the info that's being collected, but I'd love to be corrected if you think there are things that are not being collected that should be, or maybe that shouldn't be being collected. But the issue again seems to be like by whom and when, and how do we make sure that in the long term, the correct info is there, particularly so that we can see and address disproportionality.
I think it's still, for me, not clear whether or not we're recommending that the reporting party be asked that they provide it and or know it, and then where it's documented, right? So we know it's in the narrative of the trails referral, but that's not collectible data. And so, and then whether or not we're asking a reporting party how their decision to report today was influenced by their race, ethnicity, disability, you know, their sexual orientation, gender identity, all of that. So to me, that's not clear whether or not we're recommending that. And I think that was Margaret's piece about, again, you just put more and more and more on reporting parties to know that and to have to report that, and the conflict of should you or should you not know and report that.
And is that currently asked in any fashion, whether any of these demographic details motivated the report?
No, no, not to my knowledge. I would ask April and Yolanda to back that, but I would say no, it's not I mean, I think it's an ideal, but I don't think it's not in the enhanced screening guide, and it's not a question that we've refined, but it's one that I had always wanted to ask about how it's playing a role in their decision to report today. And that's just to try to draw a connection again to the disproportionality by our reporting parties.
Yeah, so it may not lead to accurate responses, but at least it triggers the sort of thought for the person reporting.
Ideally, I mean, I had always wanted in the system to be able to draw down data, and I'll pick a reporting party, you know, the medical profession. I would love to be able to say, you know, at Children's Hospital, here is your disproportionality data, right? You've made 500 reports in 2024, and of those reports, 50% of the families are Black, Hispanic, whatever, right? But yet here's how they're represented in the community that you reported, so that they could understand that there's no way to collect that data to report it out to community partners based on the type of community partner. And so good, bad, or indifferent, I think for us, in order for us to address the disproportionality, we have to be able to know that data, that information. And now it's more than just race and ethnicity. It's about disability. It's about English proficiency. It's about sexual orientation and gender identity, all of that. So I don't know. We can't report back out on that data if we don't collect that data. So is it required or is it not required to be collected by the reporting party? Whether it's accurate or not, I don't think is the question. It's us asking that, and then if they know that. And I think more and more agencies are pushing themselves to collect that data as well. And to make sure that they're asking families of that. I would love to know that from Dr. Wells. If she could tell us, you know, are they starting to collect that data in the emergency room at Children's, for example? Are they asking those questions? Are they collecting that data? They're supposed to collect it and validate it in some respect as well. I mean, I would tell schools all the time, you collect that information at the time you enroll a child into your district, because it's what the family identifies as when they are filling out the district information. And so the information is available to a lot of reporting parties.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think thanks for elevating those other pieces that we didn't quite get to answers on, because I don't think we're going to get to answers in 2 minutes, but we can at least acknowledge that those are questions that need to be addressed too, around what gets asked, where it gets asked, if it's required or part of the narrative. And then can we add a question or incorporate a question about what motivated the report? In our last couple minutes, is anyone sitting on, you know, a comment or concern that hasn't come up yet around data collection? Or a brilliant idea for what could be changed?
From a data perspective, I wonder about a designator of with the race ethnicity field as to where that information came from, so that when people are collecting, confirming the report, I don't know what kind of lift that would look like in Trails to add the source of that information, but recognizing when it came from the mandatory reporter, that you're having to take a closer look at that, or when it came from a series of assessments with the family. If there could be some kind of designator, that might be helpful.
It seems like that could be valuable about more topics than just race and ethnicity too, gender identity and sexual orientation, disability status. Okay, so I think in terms of some of the high level takeaways here, it sounds like we're heading towards support for some sort of recommendation around confirmation and correction of information that gets collected. And then outstanding questions around the things we just talked about that Michelle raised at the end here around what is asked and where it gets reported, and then maybe some potential corrections or sort of additional questions that could be in the system around what motivated reporting and where sort of knowledge of the things you're filling out actually came from, if that was a guess or an assumption versus versus something that the family shared themselves. And just going back to the child self-identification, I don't know if there could be a designation also about whether the information came from a child or a parent. That may be overly granular, but that could factor into that piece. Yeah, any big themes missing from what I just summarized? We'll have the other crew coming back in here.
But I think just for my purposes of making, compiling this information, it sounds like no dissent notably against those recommendations that were just voiced.
Okay. Doesn't sound like it. All right, well, I think we can just hang tight until the other group comes back.
Can I just tell you something interesting that I was reading a little bit ago? So I was looking at the 193307, and if you look under the second the number 2, B and D are identical. It's repeated in the statute. I don't know if anybody ever caught that when they wrote the law, but 2B and D are the same. The names and address of the person or persons responsible for the suspected abuse or neglect, if known. Not that our job is to rewrite this statute, but I thought somebody should know that.
Yeah, B is singular and D is plural. I wonder if they meant to
like put an S in parentheses. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
And if known, yes, those are like weird minor differences.
Yeah, I'm
And you
guessing
think
it
that
got
might get caught
updated
with
along the
failure?
way. Yeah, it got updated along the way and someone forgot to strike B completely. But then just in case anybody wants to rewrite that law in their free time.
I guess as we're waiting for the other subcommittee to come back in, I just wanted to say thank you, Mallory, for jumping into this and pitching in. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, sure thing. Interesting stuff and important. And yeah, April, thanks for being here and for standing in for all your colleagues for the bulk of this. It's been really helpful to have you as a resource. And thanks for sharing your email address. I'm just curious, do you guys know, like, is the vision for at some point legacy to completely go away, or is that too complicated? And they're just going to have to be sort of working in tandem for now.
Can you say that one more time, Mallory?
Just the legacy trail system, like, is the idea for that to eventually go away?
Yes, it will go away completely.
Okay, eventually. Got it.
I think the target timeframe is within the next 18 months to 2 years. Then there will be no more Trails Legacy.
Yeah, that's what I had asked
Okay.
JP, and he affirmed that general sentiment, but just wasn't able to give a firm timeline on it.
Okay. I'm facilitating another group that may be making some recommendations around sort of systems changes, and everyone is both very desirous of those changes being made and terrified about what it will take to make them. Because that's always a rough process, but it sounds like a huge improvement.
While we have a bit more time, one element that I've heard is the technical requirements of mod is higher than Trails, so that the hardware you have and access to broadband might inform whether you use legacy or mod. Is that correct? This is just like secondhand information that I've absorbed at some point along the way. But so maybe like rural versus urban considerations of how available or useful mods is.
I'm sorry. Okay, let me make sure I understand the question. Is there a difference in the rural or urban use of trails? Is that?
No, I had heard that at some point, the technical requirements for running mod might be more demanding than Trails, but this is maybe neither here nor there. We can return to it later.
Well, so for smaller rural counties that don't necessarily have their own IT departments or that type of internal infrastructure, we call those option 2 counties. And so the state manages their laptop equipment, the security settings, the access, and can provide, like we've in the past provided, cameras, especially when we were in the pandemic. So all of the technical aspects for smaller rural counties can be managed by the state if they opt into being an option 2 county and not have their own IT department. So for that purpose, like basically, I think one of the challenges though can be stable internet access. If you're traveling like in areas, if I'm traveling through the Denver metro area and I have my laptop with me, it's probably not going to be hard for me to get, to use like a hotspot through my work phone or to be able to VPN in or, do the things I need to do to protect cybersecurity while also having fairly stable internet access. I think when there are smaller rural counties and they may have to travel or they may have weather situations that knock out their Wi-Fi, or their internet access, then that can become sometimes more of a convenience issue for them. I will say though that Trails Mod you can actually access on your phone. So if you had to, like it being a dynamic application, you can log into Trails Mod because it's a web-based application through your phone. Where Trails Legacy, you can only access through a very particular means on your desktop or laptop.
I have no idea what you were saying, Yolanda, but I appreciate your comments. We are I'm sure it's good. All right, y'all, welcome back. Trusting that both groups had great conversation. I'm not seeing any requests for public comment, so I'm just going to ask out loud if there's any members of the public on the call that want to provide public comment. Please let me know. Okay, great. All right, well then that wraps up our meeting today. We are back on July 17th. And I want to just, I'm not sure for the data committee, but I know for our subcommittee, there's going to be some surveying between now and then so that we can kind of keep advancing, making sure that we're clear on where folks are as we start shaping up these remaining recommendations. So just appreciation in advance for your participation on that. It is super helpful to our planning team when you participate and kind of let us know where you are on different issues. With that said, anything from our team, Brian or Jordan, that you all need? Okay, cool. Stephanie, any closing thoughts?
Oh, there we go. Nope, just thank you all. Great to see you. Great conversations and look forward to more.
Great. And big appreciation for our guests today, both proxies and also just folks of the public that joined to listen in on the conversation. So I appreciate y'all being here, and you were certainly always welcome. We'll be back on the 17th. Okay. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Somebody